And next up, we have our local car enthusiast, John Smith, with his incredible collection.
I cannot believe this.
The summer sun was already high above the quiet cul-de-sac when the idea first took root in my mind. After years of painstaking work, weekends spent with grease-stained hands, and late nights polishing chrome under the dim light of my garage lamp, my collection of vintage cars was finally ready to be displayed. These weren't just machines, they were pieces of history, each one carrying stories of eras gone by, engines that had once roared across highways, and craftsmanship that no longer existed in modern vehicles. For as long as I could remember, the community's annual neighborhood fair had been a modest event. Folding chairs on the green lawn, lemonade stands, a raffle for a gift basket or two. It was pleasant, but unremarkable. I had often thought that the fair lacked a true centerpiece, something that could bring neighbors together and ignite real excitement. And this year, I believed I had the answer, a vintage car showcase. My restored 1965 Mustang Fastback, gleaming candy apple red with white racing stripes, was the star. The Camaro Z28 I had nursed back to life from rust was another. And perhaps my proudest project, a mint-condition 1957 Chevy Bel Air, stood like a jewel in the crown. Neighbors who passed by during my restoration often lingered at the edge of my driveway, marveling at the progress. Some even brought their kids, pointing out the cars as if introducing them to living relics. The buzz built quickly when I announced at the HOA meeting that I'd be bringing these classics to the fair. For once, excitement rippled through the room, people nodding with enthusiasm and murmuring about how their families couldn't wait to see the display. It was rare for our neighborhood to unite around anything, but the cars seemed to bridge generations and interests. Yet in that very moment, seated just 2 rows back, was the spark that would ignite the firestorm. Karen. Karen had lived in the neighborhood for nearly a decade, and in that time she had earned a reputation for her sharp tongue, endless complaints, and unrelenting need for control. Her hair, always bleached into a severe platinum bob, bobbed along with her head shakes as I spoke. She sat with her arms crossed tightly, lips pursed, radiating disapproval. For reasons no one could quite explain, Karen had appointed herself as the guardian of what she believed the neighborhood should look and feel like. She called the HOA hotline over minor infractions, a trash can left on the curb too long, grass that was a 1/4 inch too high, or kids' bicycles leaning against garage doors. Her fixation on order extended to an obsessive hatred of anything that shifted attention away from her meticulously kept rose garden, which she paraded in newsletters and demanded to be photographed for the HOA bulletin. To her, the idea that my cars might become the highlight of the fair was unthinkable. I could see it in her narrowed eyes as the neighbors clapped in support. For the first time, the spotlight was drifting from her prized roses to something far louder, shinier, and undeniably captivating. In the weeks that followed, preparations began. I carefully detailed each vehicle, ensuring every curve of chrome caught the sunlight perfectly. I ordered velvet ropes to cordon off the display, vintage posters to set the mood, and even period-correct accessories to decorate the area. My garage became a hive of activity, humming with anticipation. The neighborhood children peeked in to watch me work, their faces lighting up with wonder at engines older than their grandparents. But just as the excitement grew, so did Karen's resentment. She began with subtle comments, dropped like shards of glass into casual conversations. At a morning coffee gathering, she remarked that cars only attract grease and trouble. At the community email board, she questioned whether the fair should really become a mechanic's sideshow. Her words were brushed off by most, but the bitterness behind them was impossible to miss. Then came the strange occurrences. A small but deliberate scratch appeared on the side panel of my Camaro one morning, shallow but fresh. At first, I convinced myself it was an accident, but then a neighbor spotted Karen lingering suspiciously near my driveway late one evening, holding her phone as if documenting some imagined violation. I began to sense that her disapproval had shifted into something darker. Sabotage. Still, I pressed forward, refusing to be derailed. The fair was drawing closer, and the buzz around the cars was undeniable. Flyers went out with a photo of the Mustang, and the event's social media posts suddenly received more engagement than they ever had before. The neighborhood, usually quiet and subdued, was alive with anticipation. The night before the fair, I stayed in the garage until nearly midnight, giving each car one final polish. The Bel Air's chrome bumper reflected my tired face like a mirror, but pride swelled in my chest. Tomorrow, I thought, the community would see not just cars, but years of dedication and history brought back to life. But as I closed the garage door and turned off the light, a chill of unease crept over me. Something told me Karen wasn't finished. The attention she craved had slipped away, and in its place grew a storm of envy. I didn't yet know how far she was willing to go, and as the morning of the fair dawned bright and clear, the stage was set, not just for a car show, but for a battle of pride, pettiness, and public spectacle that no one in our neighborhood would ever forget. The morning of the neighborhood fair arrived with a kind of restless anticipation that hung in the air like static before a storm. The streets, usually quiet and orderly, buzzed with activity. Tents were being pitched on the green lawn, folding tables unfolded with the clatter of metal legs, and the faint smell of kettle corn drifted from the corner where vendors were setting up. Children darted about in bursts of laughter, already caught in the thrill of the day ahead. For me, though, the morning was about far more than lemonade stands or raffle tickets. It was the culmination of years of work and a chance to share my passion with a community that had only glimpsed pieces of it from the edge of my driveway. As I rolled each car out of the garage one by one, the sun caught their polished surfaces, scattering light in sharp gleams of chrome and candy-colored paint. The Mustang's deep red shimmered like molten glass. The Camaro glowed with its sleek, dark lines, and the Bel Air practically sparkled, as though it had just left the showroom in 1957. Neighbors passing by slowed their steps, unable to resist taking in the sight. Some pulled out phones, snapping pictures even before the display was officially set up. Compliments came in the form of wide-eyed stares, approving nods, and hushed remarks of awe. The buzz was undeniable. The cars were the main attraction of the fair, yet even in that moment of triumph, I felt the weight of unseen eyes. Karen's house loomed across the street, its shutters tightly drawn, as though it too was disapproving. Though I hadn't seen her yet that morning, I sensed her presence like a storm cloud waiting beyond the horizon. By mid-morning, the fairgrounds came alive. Music floated from speakers, the clinking of soda bottles mixed with the chatter of neighbors, and kids tugged their parents toward the car display with urgent curiosity. My section was roped off with velvet cords, vintage posters propped along the edges, and small placards describing the history of each car. It wasn't just a display, it was a stage, and the crowd that gathered only grew thicker as the day unfolded. But not everyone watched with admiration. From the corner of my eye, I noticed her at last, Karen. She emerged from her house with a forced air of grace, carrying a basket of roses clipped from her garden. She walked stiffly, her posture taut, as though bracing herself against a world that refused to conform to her expectations. The roses, their petals unnaturally perfect, were meant to draw attention back to her, her contribution to the fair, her moment in the sun. But no one lingered at her basket. No one cared. The tide of attention flowed toward the cars, and Karen, despite her carefully rehearsed presentation, was left adrift. The shift in her expression was subtle but unmistakable. The tight smile faltered, her eyes narrowed, and the basket hung limply from her arm. She lingered near the edges of the crowd, watching as children pressed close to the ropes around the cars, their parents marveling at the details I had so carefully restored. She watched as people pulled out their phones to record, their laughter bright, their admiration genuine. And with each passing moment, she sank deeper into the shadows of irrelevance. It was then that the first hint of trouble began. Near the Camaro, I noticed a small puddle forming beneath the car. At first I panicked. Had I overlooked something mechanical? But the liquid was unmistakably water, not oil or gasoline. A closer look revealed the culprit. A plastic water bottle, hidden just behind one of the wheels, its cap deliberately loosened to leak slowly onto the ground. It was meant to mimic a breakdown, to cast doubt on the car's reliability, to embarrass me in front of the crowd. I quietly removed it, but suspicion burned in my mind. Only one person in this neighborhood was petty enough, desperate enough to stage such an act. My eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on Karen, standing with her arms crossed, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. Still, I refused to let her win. The bottle was gone, the display intact, and the attention remained squarely on the cars. But Karen wasn't finished. Later, as I circled around the Bel Air to answer a neighbor's question, I noticed another small disturbance. The placard in front of the Mustang had been flipped upside down. It was a petty act, childish even, but it revealed her hand more clearly than ever. She was meddling, sabotaging in ways that were meant to go unnoticed, meant to sow doubt and disarray without anyone realizing. But she underestimated the crowd. Instead of being misled, neighbors grew protective. One man quietly straightened the placard, casting a suspicious glance toward Karen. A group of kids who had been admiring the Bel Air whispered among themselves about how they'd seen someone sneaking near the ropes. Even without my prompting, the community began to connect the dots. Karen's attempts to undermine me only highlighted her pettiness. Each small act, instead of tearing me down, became another thread in the story the neighborhood was weaving about her, a story of envy, sabotage, and desperation, and yet the worst was still to come. By late afternoon, as the fair reached its peak, the crowd around my cars was at its largest. Phones were raised high, photos snapped, and the hum of admiration grew louder. It was in that moment, when attention was at its height, that Karen made her boldest move yet. Slipping past the crowd, she approached the Bel Air, a small vial clutched in her hand. What she hadn't realized was that too many eyes were watching now, too many people alert to her strange behavior. Even as she leaned in, intending to smear something across the pristine chrome bumper, whispers began to ripple through the crowd. I turned just as she froze, caught in the act by the collective gaze of the community. Her hand hovered mid-air, the vial trembling in her grip, the weight of dozens of eyes pressing down on her. The moment stretched thin, fragile, on the edge of collapse. And just like that, the tide began to turn. The scene froze like a photograph, every detail suspended in the heat of the afternoon sun. Karen's hand hovered near the Bel Air's chrome bumper, the small vial clutched tightly between her fingers. The crowd that had been buzzing with admiration for the cars fell silent, their murmurs replaced by an almost tangible wave of disbelief. Eyes widened, heads tilted, and in that shared stillness, the truth became undeniable. She wasn't just lurking or muttering complaints or rearranging placards. She was caught, mid-act, in an attempt to sabotage the very heart of the fair. Karen's face drained of color as she realized the weight of the stares. She tried to compose herself, straightening her shoulders as though she were the victim of some misunderstanding, but it was too late. The neighbors had seen enough. Some exchanged knowing glances while others folded their arms. Their earlier suspicions confirmed. The vial, a cheap concoction of liquid that she had likely intended to smear across the car's finish, trembled in her grasp. To her, it may have seemed a small gesture, a way to dull the shine, to mar the perfect reflection, to create just enough damage to make my prized restoration look flawed. But in the context of the fair, in the context of the months of excitement leading up to this day, it was more than an act of pettiness. It was an act of betrayal against the community itself. A few children near the ropes pulled back, whispering to their parents. Some adults shook their heads in disbelief. Others raised their phones, recording the moment, capturing her poised in the act of destruction. Karen had always thrived on the shadows of rumor, on whispers behind closed doors, but here, under the bright light of afternoon and surrounded by dozens of witnesses, she found herself the unwilling star of a story she couldn't control. And yet, instead of backing down, she chose escalation. With a sudden, almost defiant flick of her wrist, she let the vial slip from her hand. It shattered against the pavement, releasing a pungent chemical odor that wafted through the air. The crowd recoiled instinctively, not out of danger, but out of the sheer audacity of what they had just witnessed. Karen turned sharply on her heel, muttering to herself, as though she could still twist the narrative in her favor, as though her act of sabotage could somehow be painted as an accident. But the damage was done, not to the cars, but to her reputation. The rest of the afternoon unfolded under a strange tension. The cars remained the highlight of the fair, admired and celebrated by neighbors. But now the conversations carried an undercurrent. People whispered about what they had seen, recounting the details to those who hadn't witnessed it firsthand. "Did you see her hand?" some would say. "She had something in that vial." Others nodded knowingly, finally connecting the dots of the earlier incidents, the leaking bottle, the flipped placard, the strange scratches. What once seemed like coincidences now became part of a larger pattern of deliberate sabotage. Karen, meanwhile, hovered at the fringes of the fair. Her roses, once carefully arranged in a basket, sat forgotten on a folding table. No one stopped to admire them. No one asked her about her garden. She lingered like a shadow, watching the crowd gravitate toward the cars she had tried so hard to undermine. What she hadn't realized, or perhaps refused to accept, was that her actions had transformed the story of the fair. It was no longer just about the cars. It was about resilience in the face of pettiness. It was about a community that had come together not just to admire history on wheels, but to witness the downfall of someone who had always thrived on tearing others down. The evening sun dipped lower, casting golden light over the polished hoods of the cars. Neighbors snapped final photos, children pointed excitedly, and laughter filled the air. The fair was, by all accounts, a success, but as I began to pack up the display, carefully guiding each car back toward the safety of my garage, I noticed Karen lingering once more. Her eyes burned with something deeper than mere annoyance. It was humiliation sharp and unyielding, and in that humiliation brewed a dangerous resolve. Because people like Karen rarely accept defeat gracefully. That night, as the fair wound down and neighbors retreated to their homes, the chatter about her sabotage continued. Social media posts from the event began circulating, photos and short clips of the cars gaining dozens of comments and shares. But buried among the admiration were snapshots of Karen herself, her hand caught midair, the vial gleaming between her fingers. The story was spreading faster than she could contain it, and every attempt she made to explain herself only seemed to stoke the fire. Her reputation, once built on intimidation and control, was beginning to unravel. The authority she wielded through the HOA felt thinner now, weaker, undermined by the very people she had once bullied. But humiliation is a powerful motivator, and by the time the sun rose the next morning, it was clear that Karen wasn't finished. The sabotage at the fair had been bold, reckless even, but it was only the beginning. In her mind, she had been upstaged, embarrassed, and mocked in front of the entire neighborhood. And if there was one thing Karen could not abide, it was the loss of her carefully cultivated image. The stage was set for something larger, something more destructive. She would not fade quietly into the background. No, she would strike again harder this time. And in her desperation to reclaim control, she would cross lines she could never uncross. The cars had survived her first attempt. The community had seen through her schemes. But a storm was gathering, and soon everyone would feel its impact. The night after the fair was restless. The hum of excitement still echoed through the neighborhood. Neighbors posting photos of their families smiling beside the cars, children recounting the day's events, and parents remarking on how the car show had transformed an otherwise ordinary fair into something unforgettable. The community was alive with a shared sense of pride, the kind that lingers long after the tents are folded away. But within that same neighborhood, behind closed blinds and tightly shut doors, another energy brewed, darker, heavier. For Karen, humiliation was not a fleeting discomfort. It was a festering wound. She had been seen, caught red-handed, her act of sabotage immortalized in phone footage and whispers that traveled faster than she could spin excuses. For a woman who had spent years carefully cultivating an image of control, superiority, and authority, the public spectacle of her failure was unbearable. And when humiliation takes root in someone like Karen, it grows into vengeance. The morning after the fair, the HOA email board lit up. Karen had submitted a formal complaint, written in the stern, clipped language she always used when wielding the bylaws like weapons. She argued that the cars had been a safety hazard, attracting too much foot traffic, creating liability risks, and disturbing the decorum of the event. To the casual reader, it might have seemed like a procedural note, but to those who had been at the fair, it was transparent this was not about safety. This was about revenge. But what Karen did not anticipate was the shift in tone from the community. For once, the neighbors didn't bend to her words. Replies flooded in, measured, respectful but firm, pushing back against her claims. Parents pointed out how much joy the cars had brought their children. Retirees praised the craftsmanship, remarking that they hadn't seen cars like those since their youth. Others dismissed her concerns outright, reminding her of the chemical vial she had nearly smeared across the Bel Air. The HOA board, usually quick to entertain Karen's complaints, remained silent, hesitant to side with her in the face of mounting evidence. Her grip was loosening, and she knew it. That night, under the cover of darkness, she decided that words weren't enough. If she couldn't bury my reputation through emails and accusations, then she would take matters into her own hands. The street was quiet as Karen slipped from her house, dressed in dark clothes that made her nearly invisible in the shadows. She carried with her a small toolkit, nothing elaborate but enough to do damage if she had the chance. A screwdriver, a set of pliers, and a jar of thick, tar-like substance she had concocted from household chemicals. Her plan was simple. She would tamper with the cars directly, inflict damage so severe that the next time I unveiled them, they would not shine, but sputter and fail. She crept across the street with the careful steps of someone who believed she was unseen. But the neighborhood, though asleep, was not entirely blind. Security cameras installed on porches and garages silently tracked her movement. One neighbor's motion-activated light flicked on as she passed, startling her for a moment, but she pressed forward, determined. Karen reached the garage where my cars were parked. The Bel Air, Mustang, and Camaro sat like silent sentinels, their polished exteriors glinting faintly in the moonlight that seeped through the small window. She crouched low, fumbling with the edge of the garage door, trying to find a way in. But what Karen hadn't accounted for was the ripple effect of her earlier sabotage. The community had grown wary, protective. Some neighbors, suspicious of what she might attempt, had kept a quiet watch. One man, walking his dog late at night, noticed her silhouette and paused. Another, glancing at his phone, received a motion alert from his camera and opened the feed to see her crouched at the garage door. Texts began to circulate quietly among a handful of neighbors. "She's out there again." Inside, I remained unaware. Exhausted from the long day, I had gone to bed early, convinced that the ordeal was behind me. The garage was locked, the cars safe, or so I thought. Karen's attempts grew more frantic. She smeared some of the thick black substance along the bottom seam of the garage door, hoping it would seep inward and mar the polished tires. She tried jamming the screwdriver into the lock, rattling it with increasing frustration. Each failed attempt only deepened her resolve, her movements more erratic, more careless. And then came the breaking point. One of the neighbors, unwilling to let her sabotage escalate unchecked, stepped outside and cleared his throat loudly. The sound shattered the silence of the street, startling Karen so badly that she dropped the jar she was holding. It cracked open on the driveway, spilling its sticky contents in a dark pool. She froze, caught once again, this time not in the bustle of the fair, but in the quiet, undeniable clarity of night. Lights flicked on in nearby houses. Curtains shifted. The neighborhood, drawn by curiosity and suspicion, began to stir. Karen, realizing she was visible, bolted for her house, her footsteps echoing sharply against the pavement. But the damage was already done, not to the cars, but to her. More eyes had seen her this time. More witnesses had evidence. And unlike the fair, this time her actions were not easily twisted into misunderstandings. By morning, the story spread like wildfire. Neighbors shared the grainy but clear footage from security cameras, showing Karen crouched at the garage, her tools in hand. The spilled jar of chemicals still stained the driveway, an undeniable mark of her intent. The narrative was no longer one of suspicion, it was certainty, but Karen, cornered and exposed, would not retreat. Instead, she doubled down. She began storming into HOA offices, demanding emergency meetings, insisting that she was being targeted and harassed. She spun stories of conspiracies against her, claiming that the neighborhood had banded together to smear her good name. But every word she uttered only deepened her isolation, only reinforced the growing consensus that she was the problem. And yet in her desperation, Karen was preparing for something bigger, because humiliation in public is one thing. But to someone like her, losing control completely was unthinkable. If sabotage in the shadows hadn't worked, she would try again, this time in broad daylight with all the force she could muster. The fair had been the stage of her first downfall. But the neighborhood was about to become the stage of something far larger, and when it unfolded, there would be no going back. By the end of the week, the neighborhood no longer whispered about Karen's sabotage. They spoke openly, their voices tinged with frustration, disbelief, and a kind of collective exhaustion. The footage from the night outside my garage had left little room for doubt. Her crouched figure, her clumsy attempt at prying the lock, the spilled jar of chemicals. It all played like a damning reel on phones and doorbell camera apps. For once, people weren't afraid to call her out. But humiliation has a way of transforming someone like Karen. Instead of backing down, she simmered with a furious energy that demanded an outlet. She could not stand being the subject of ridicule, could not stomach the idea of losing her grip on the community. In her mind, she had to reclaim control, to rewrite the narrative in her favor. And so, she began to plot a spectacle, not another secretive act of sabotage in the shadows, but a bold, public attempt to turn the tide. It began with flyers. Dozens of them appeared taped to mailboxes, slipped under doors, and pinned to the notice board by the clubhouse. The papers, written in her sharp, authoritative handwriting, were designed to look official, stamped with fabricated HOA headers. They claimed that the vintage car display had violated neighborhood codes, that it posed a danger to property values, and that the entire event had been a reckless misuse of community resources. She even added a bold claim that the HOA was investigating me for misconduct. But the neighbors weren't fooled. If anything, the flyers backfired. Parents who had seen their kids' faces light up at the fair crumpled them in disgust. Elderly residents who had spent hours admiring the Bel Air dismissed the claims as nonsense. The very attempt to smear me only reinforced the truth. Karen was desperate. Still, she wasn't finished. The HOA called for a community meeting to address the escalating tension. It was meant to be routine, a chance to air grievances and restore calm, but Karen seized it as her stage. She arrived early, dressed in her sharpest blazer, her hair immaculately styled, clutching a thick binder of evidence. Her eyes gleamed with the determination of someone who believed this was her moment to reclaim dominance. The room filled quickly. Neighbors who might normally skip such meetings came in droves, curiosity pulling them in. Some came with their phones ready, anticipating another dramatic scene. The air was thick with expectation, every seat filled, every hallway crowded. And in the middle of it all stood Karen, waiting to unleash her performance. When the meeting began, she wasted no time. She launched into a tirade about safety violations, reckless endangerment, and community standards. She waved papers in the air, citing bylaws and fabrications, her voice rising with each accusation. She painted herself as the guardian of the neighborhood, the only one brave enough to stand against the supposed chaos brought by my cars. But the more she spoke, the clearer it became. This wasn't about safety or rules or property values. It was about her jealousy, her desperation for control, her inability to accept that something, anything, could exist in the neighborhood without her being at the center of it. And then, just as she reached the height of her rant, the community struck back, not with shouts or arguments, but with undeniable evidence. A neighbor stood and projected the footage from the fair. The image of Karen caught mid-act with the vial near the Bel Air. Another played the clip from the security camera outside my garage, showing her fumbling with tools in the dead of night. The room, once filled with her voice, now echoed with gasps, murmurs, and the unmistakable sound of collective realization. Karen's face flushed crimson. She tried to deny it, to wave away the evidence as misunderstandings or fabrications, but the truth was too clear. The footage was grainy, yes, but it was unmistakably her. The jar of chemicals. The screwdriver. The timing. The crowd had already connected the dots, and no amount of bluster could erase what they had seen. What followed was not the triumph she had imagined, but a public unraveling. Her voice cracked as she shouted over the murmurs, her hands trembling as she clutched her binder. She lashed out, accusing the neighborhood of conspiring against her, claiming she was the victim of harassment. But the more she raged, the more the crowd turned against her. Parents shook their heads, retirees muttered in disappointment, and even her few allies sat silently, unwilling to defend her any longer. It was the moment everyone would remember, the point where Karen lost whatever shred of authority she still clung to. Her voice rose to a piercing shriek, her composure shattered, her desperation laid bare for all to see. The HOA board, usually deferential to her demands, shifted uncomfortably, their faces betraying a new resolve. They couldn't side with her now, not with the entire neighborhood watching, not with the evidence so plain. The meeting ended not with her victory, but with her humiliation. The HOA board announced they would be formally reviewing her conduct. The neighbors, once hesitant to speak against her, left the room buzzing with relief, their laughter spilling into the night. And Karen, red-faced and trembling, stormed out clutching her binder to her chest, her footsteps echoing like thunder. But if the fair had been her first downfall, and the garage incident her second, then this meeting was her collapse. Yet even as she crumbled, there was a glint in her eyes, an ember of defiance that hadn't yet gone out, because people like Karen don't vanish quietly. They don't surrender gracefully. They thrash, they claw, they scheme until the very last moment. And though her influence was gone, though her reputation was in tatters, I knew she wasn't finished. She had been exposed in public, humiliated beyond repair, and stripped of the control she so desperately craved. And when someone like Karen finds herself with nothing left to lose, that's when she becomes most dangerous. The community thought the ordeal was over. They thought the meeting had ended it all. But in the quiet hours of the following days, she was already plotting her final reckless move. And when it came, it would shake the neighborhood in ways no one could have predicted. In the days following the disastrous HOA meeting, the neighborhood settled into a strange calm. For the first time in years, the air felt lighter, freer, as if an oppressive weight had finally lifted. Karen had been stripped of her influence, her authority dismantled in front of dozens of witnesses. Neighbors who once tiptoed around her now openly laughed about her antics, their voices carrying across lawns and porches. It seemed for a fleeting moment that her reign was truly over. But people like Karen rarely fade into the background quietly. Her pride, battered though it was, still burned with a twisted energy. Humiliation had not broken her. It had hardened her. And so she stewed in her bitterness, convinced that she could claw her way back, that one bold act could erase the mockery and restore her dominance. That opportunity, in her mind, arrived with the announcement of the regional car showcase. Unlike the neighborhood fair, this event drew crowds from beyond the HOA's manicured borders. Enthusiasts, collectors, and local media would attend, all eager to marvel at rows of gleaming classics. For me, it was the chance to show my prized Bel Air alongside other restored treasures, a moment of pride years in the making. For Karen, it was a nightmare, the thought of me basking in admiration. The possibility of my story overshadowing her fabricated authority was unbearable, and so she hatched her final scheme. The showcase was held on a bright Saturday morning in a sprawling community park. Vendors lined the pathways, children darted between food stands, and families gathered under shade trees. My Bel Air gleamed under the sun, polished to perfection, every chrome detail reflecting the sky like glass. Crowds gathered around asking questions, taking photos, their admiration spilling over like applause. Unbeknownst to me, Karen had arrived early, her face hidden under oversized sunglasses, her arms clutching a canvas tote. She circled the rows of cars like a predator searching for weakness, her eyes narrowing when she spotted the Bel Air. Her plan was crude, but calculated. She carried a vial of corrosive cleaner, the same kind she had once attempted to use in secret. This time, however, she intended to act boldly, in full view of the crowd, spinning her sabotage as an act of community protection. In her twisted logic, she could frame me as the villain, the careless neighbor endangering others, while painting herself as the hero who stopped it. But arrogance is often the downfall of people like Karen. As the announcer introduced the cars, she moved closer, her hand slipping into her tote. With a practiced flick, she unscrewed the cap of the vial, her eyes darting nervously toward the crowd. And then, with a dramatic flourish, she lunged forward, raising the vial high as if to pour its contents across the hood of the Bel Air. The moment froze in time. Gasps rippled through the audience, heads turned, cameras rose. Dozens of phones caught the scene from every angle, the furious gleam in her eye, the twisted determination on her face, the glint of liquid poised to spill. But before she could complete her act, her heel caught on the edge of the curb. What happened next was nothing short of poetic. Karen stumbled forward, arms flailing, the vial slipping from her grasp. It shattered on the pavement, splashing harmlessly onto the asphalt, the corrosive liquid fizzing and smoking in the sunlight. The crowd recoiled in horror at first, then erupted in stunned silence as she sprawled face first onto the ground, her sunglasses skidding several feet away. Her carefully rehearsed display had crumbled into a spectacle of clumsy chaos. The announcer rushed forward, flanked by volunteers, while onlookers recorded every second. Karen scrambled to her knees, her hands trembling, her face flushed with panic. She tried to spin the moment, shouting about danger and safety violations, but the crowd wasn't buying it. They had seen everything: the raised vial, the intent in her eyes, the way she had lunged toward the Bel Air. Her words fell flat, drowned out by murmurs of disgust and disbelief. Parents pulled their children closer. Collectors shook their heads in contempt. Someone shouted for security, and moments later, 2 uniformed officers arrived. The videos played back instantly on phones thrust toward them, footage of Karen's attempted sabotage, her vial breaking across the pavement, her reckless disregard for safety in a crowded public space. There was no argument left to make. The evidence was irrefutable. Karen was escorted away, her protests growing weaker with each step, her once commanding presence reduced to a pitiful spectacle. Neighbors who had long endured her tyranny now stood with arms crossed, satisfaction gleaming in their eyes. She wasn't just humiliated this time, she was finished. The showcase continued, though the incident lingered in every conversation. My Bel Air, unscathed and shining brighter than ever, became the centerpiece of the event, not just for its restoration, but for surviving the chaos unblemished. People flocked to it, snapping photos, marveling at the chrome, whispering about the drama that had unfolded. The story spread quickly, carried by social media, the clips of Karen's downfall going viral within hours. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the community's verdict was clear. Karen had lost everything: her credibility, her influence, and the fragile respect she once commanded. The HOA board issued a formal notice stripping her of any position within the association. Neighbors stopped answering her calls. Vendors and organizers banned her from future events. She had become not the protector of property values she claimed to be, but the cautionary tale of the neighborhood. As for me, the Bel Air gleamed proudly, a symbol not just of restoration, but of resilience. It stood as proof that passion and perseverance could outshine pettiness, that a community united could withstand even the most relentless saboteur. And while the scars of her antics lingered in memory, they were softened by the laughter, the solidarity, and the priceless humiliation that had finally brought Karen down. In the end, the attention she had tried so desperately to steal was hers after all, but not in the way she intended. Her downfall was immortalized in clips and stories, shared far beyond the borders of the HOA, and my cars, once the target of her envy, rolled on unscathed, admired by a community that had learned the power of standing together. The neighborhood would never forget the day Karen tried to sabotage the car show, and the way her plan backfired spectacularly, cementing her place in history not as the ruler of the block, but as the punchline of its most infamous story.